Hi, my name's Trevor, and in this video we're going to be talking about training. Specifically, we're going to define what we mean when we say training. We're going to explain why people engage in training. We're going to talk about what types of things you can get better at through training. And lastly, we're going to lay a foundation for how you should train. So let's begin with a definition. You can define training as a process for developing the knowledge, skills, or abilities, typically with the goal of improving your ability to complete a task or a goal. And let's kind of break that down into specific segments. So the first part is knowledge, skills, or abilities and how they relate to a task or a goal. So let's start with a goal. Let's say I play baseball and my goal is to throw this ball 100 miles an hour. To begin the ability, and if I wanted to achieve that goal or that task, the first thing I would need to know is what I need to do technically to achieve that. So how should I hold the ball? What should I be doing with my arm mechanics? Right? All of those things are going to impact whether or not I'm able to achieve the task. So that's the knowledge piece, and it's entirely up here in your brain in knowing what you should do. Skill, on the other hand, is the ability to take that knowledge and what you're supposed to do and actually execute it. So I could know I need to hold my elbow up as I'm rotating around, but if I haven't practiced it enough, I might not be able to actually execute it. So skill is really where the knowledge piece goes into action and how you're able to transfer it from your brain into your body and into the things you're doing. The last one then is ability. And I could know exactly what I'm supposed to do. I could practice for years on end, and I probably won't be able to throw this ball 100 miles an hour. And there are a variety of different physical reasons why I could not do that, right? Maybe I'm not tall enough or my arms aren't long enough to generate enough force to throw it 100 miles an hour. Maybe my muscles are too weak because I haven't done enough training specifically for them to improve my throwing. Or better yet, maybe I used to be able to throw 100 miles an hour, but then I got injured or I had something happen to me to where I no longer have that ability. So if knowledge is kind of the information you store in your brain, skill is how you take that information and then apply it in your body, abilities are the physical characteristics within your body that allow you to do different stuff. And if we talk about disabilities, what we're talking about there is we're talking about lacking the capacity to do different tasks. So if you're in a wheelchair and you have a disability and you can't walk upstairs, right, that's the opposite of having the ability to do something. And so when we're talking about training, we can improve your knowledge level or your information, what you know what to do. We can improve your skill through practice, through working on different techniques. Or we can actually improve your abilities and change your physiology, what's going on in your body that will allow you to do a different task or achieve a goal. And so depending on what stage you're at in training will usually dictate what your training looks like. Is it information-based early on? Is it skill-based where we need to practice and use that information? Or are we at a point where we're just trying to increase our physiological abilities? Now, that definition is a good starting point, but if we really want to understand what training is, we need to take a step back and we need to look at things really big picture. And to do that, I like to start looking at it from a biological perspective. And if you're familiar with biology, you know it's the study of living things. And all living things are hardwired, are programmed for survival. And so when we're looking at training and we're looking at what it does, training is a way of increasing our chances of survival. And we have a couple things here to unpack. So first, when we're talking about survival, we can be looking at it on an individual basis, or we can look at it from a species standpoint. So as an individual, I want to live as long as possible. When I'm in an environment, I want to do whatever it takes to keep my DNA alive, right? In the short term, being alive is essential, and that's what we do as living creatures. But we're also playing a game of long-term survival of our genes. So I know that best case scenario, as a human, I might live to be 110, 120 years old, maybe with some modern advances in medicine, right? But big picture, that's not very long. And so I'm also programmed to want to spread my genes and continue on the legacy of my survival through my offspring. Survival isn't just about here and now, it's also about procreating and spreading your genes long term. And so when we talk about training, you'll actually see that training is about short-term survival and improving your odds of success, but it's also important for becoming more sexually attractive, which will then allow you to mate and will allow you to spread your genes long term. And both are actually really important to understand if we're trying to figure out why people train. Now, how does training improve your chances of survival? Well, biological mechanism for doing this is called adaptation. And all adaptation is it's changing yourself to better fit your environment. So if I'm in a really hot climate, you take me close to the equator and it's really hot outside, maybe I go closer to Texas, let's say, my physiology can actually change to help me survive in extreme heat. One thing I can do is I can actually get a body tan, right? And that'll help me block some of the harmful radiation coming from the sun. I can also increase things like my sweat rate. So when I'm outside, my body starts sweating faster, and when I sweat, I actually hold on to things like salt and other electrolytes so that I don't have issues if I run out. And so changes in sweating, changes in how I regulate my body temperature, changes in how I'm able to block some of those harmful rays from the sun, all occur through adaptation and bodily adaptations to different types of stress. And so when you have a stressor, when you're in an environment and the environment is essentially trying to kill you, if you can adapt to that environment, you're better able to survive with less effort and less energy. And so we call that an adaptation or adaptive behavior. On the other side of this, if I take all those adaptations, so I'm more tan, I'm blocking some of the sun's rays, I sweat really quickly, I don't have a lot of body fat, which acts as a good insulator, and then you take me and you put me in Antarctica, I'll die a lot quicker than I would have if I didn't have that tan, if I had more body fat, and if I didn't sweat as much, because what's adaptive in one environment can actually be harmful in another. And we actually call changes that are not adaptive or hurt your chances of survival in a different environment, we call that maladaptive changes. So it's maladaptive for cold climates to not have a lot of body fat. It's adaptive in warm climates to not have body fat, okay? So when we're talking about training and we're talking about making physiological changes to our body, we have to understand that some of those changes might work in some environments, but they'll actually hurt us or inhibit our ability to survive in others. And so we're having this constant battle of adaptive versus maladaptive changes depending on the environment. One thing you might know is that our environment isn't constant. So what might work for the summer months in Illinois or in Indiana would actually hurt you in the winter months. And so humans, we're not these static beings, we're not only geared to live in one particular environment, we have a great ability to actually change to our surroundings. And so all training is it's our ability to change our physiology, our ability to improve our knowledge, our ability to improve our skills so that we can survive in almost any environment, right? We're able to go deep down in the ocean in a submarine, we're able to go all the way up into outer space, and we're able to survive and live despite drastically different environmental conditions. And so understanding training is really understanding about what an environment is and how we can actually change to that environment. Now, if we're talking about why people train, it's helpful to look at it in terms of what their goals are. And while there are a variety of different goals on why people might train, most people's goals will fall into one of three categories. Category one is health or fitness. And maybe someone has been diagnosed with diabetes. Maybe someone has back pain because they injured themselves while doing manual labor. Maybe someone's getting older and they're not able to go upstairs or they're out of breath doing these things, right? Any goal that's designed to help you live longer or improve your quality of life or improve your overall fitness would typically fall into this first category. And it's important to recognize that these people really just want to feel better on a day-to-day basis, right? Maybe they're scared of having different consequences. So maybe they're scared of diabetes because someone in their life had that. Maybe they've seen people who are overweight and they know that it can cause joint problems or joint pain. Or maybe it's already gotten to a point where they're experiencing that pain or they're experiencing different problems associated with their health. And so as practitioners, if we know that someone's coming to us from a health standpoint, a lot of times it's because they're either in physical pain or they're afraid because they've seen someone go down that road. And so these people are really going to respond to helping them live a higher quality life and feeling better on a day-to-day basis. The next type of goal is performance. And while people want to feel better, we also have subsets within our population that just want to perform at a very high level. So if you're a paramedic or even a firefighter, you need physical abilities to get to the people you're trying to help and to overcome different obstacles during your job. And so for them, performance can be life or death or the ability to help someone or not. And so they're going to approach training very differently and they're going to work very hard because it's directly tied to what they do for a living or what they do out of the kindness of their heart. Okay? The same thing can be said about pro athletes. Pro athletes probably spend more time training and developing themselves physically and mentally than most other professions or most other jobs in the entire world. And so if we are studying training, it would be silly not to look at people who are at the peak of human performance. And so if we're looking at them, why do they train? A lot of times it's because they hate losing and they want to be able to do things to a very high level. They're very competitive and losing is actually damaging or it even causes them some type of psychological pain. And so performance in this way can actually mean getting again away from pain through performing better, having the abilities, knowledge, skills, etc. to accomplish specific tasks related to their job. The last one then is aesthetic-based goals. And aesthetics can just be defined as wanting to look a certain way or wanting to look good. And like I said before, we are all programmed for our immediate survival, but we're also programmed for long-term survival through passing on our genes to our offspring. And we call this sexual selection. And that's one of the main primary biological factors that drives human behavior. And what we know, and again, this can be a really controversial topic, but we know that different characteristics of health and fitness and being in good physical shape are sexually desirable in our mates. Right? We want someone we know can take care of themselves and potentially take care of those around them. Right? That's attractive to us. And so some people will engage in a lot of training to improve their aesthetics, how they look, how confident they feel projecting towards others, because they want some type of appraisal from other people and they want to be viewed as fit that way. And I think it's really dangerous as practitioners to take everyone who has an aesthetics-based goal and characterize them as someone who's vain or someone who is really shallow and narcissistic, because in actuality, we have a lot of things built into our biology that make us want to look good, make us want to be healthy and fit. And so while certainly there are problems with this, we can talk about things like eating disorders, we can talk about things like exercise addiction or other harmful behaviors, the root of it is actually something that I think a lot of humans should strive for, and that's being your healthiest self, that's being as sexually attractive as you can be in this world. And so that's really what that third goal is about, is it's about looking and feeling a certain way or looking good so that you can feel confident about yourself. Now, those are the three big categories of training goals. However, you might encounter someone who doesn't neatly fit into one of those goals, or maybe they want more than one of those goals to happen. So maybe they want to lose some weight because they'll look better, but they also know that there are some health problems associated with being overweight or being obese. And while that's certainly the case, and a lot of people who engage in training want one, if not all three of those goals, usually one's going to take priority. And I'll use athletes as a really good example. When you're engaged in high-level athletics, so elite college athletes all the way up to Olympic level athletes, you will actually start doing things in your training and start doing things to perform well that will hurt your long-term health. If you look at a lot of athletes after they retire, a lot of them have a lot of wear and tear on their joints and they have to get joint replacements, or they deal with pain on a regular basis because of how harshly they treated their body when competing. And most athletes have come to terms with the fact that their long-term health might be secondary to performing at a really high level and reaching the pinnacle of human performance, right? It's a trade-off. Yes, I want to perform really well, but if that causes me low back pain over the years, it's worth it. There's actually a story about a professional football player, and he got injured during the playoffs, and the doctors told him he wasn't allowed to play in the Super Bowl because of his injury. And he was talking with his doctors, he was arguing with his doctors, and he agreed to amputate his finger so that he could perform and play in the Super Bowl. So for him, it was actually worth it to lose a finger if he could play in the Super Bowl and if he could play at that high level. Because he knew he might never get back to that level of competition and he might never be able to do that again. And so that's just one example of how sometimes these goals can actually compete. And I talked earlier about things like anorexia or other eating disorders. For those people, they're prioritizing aesthetics or looking a certain way over their long-term health and their well-being. And so these goals, while sometimes they'll be synergistic and they'll overlap and improving in one will help you improve in others, sometimes they can also battle and they can actually have some detriments or they can actually fight. Now, if we're talking about what can be trained, we can kind of go back to that definition we started with. And we said it's the knowledge, which can be like that information or even strategies you engage in when competing in a sport or when doing an activity. It could be the skills, which are those techniques which we talked about, being able to execute on that information. Or it could be the abilities or the physiological changes that occur. So if my muscle gets bigger, or my heart gets stronger, or my brain expands and it improves, all of those things would allow me to perform at a higher level. That's kind of the basis, what we call KSAs, or knowledge, skills, and ability. Another way of thinking about it is looking at it from a hardware versus software standpoint. And the analogy I like to use, or what I like to talk about, is cell phones, because I think almost everyone has access to a phone. Now, if we're talking about the hardware of your phone, we're talking about things like what camera is inside of it, what speaker is in there, what microchip is in there, how big is your screen, right? They're physical things that make up your phone. But we also have hardware aspects within your phone. So it's not the structural components. Your phone might look exactly the same and you haven't changed anything structurally. But if you get a software update, now your phone can do new cool things. And this is how training works. Training works through either improving your operating system, which again is those neurological changes, what's going on in your brain, which would be like the knowledge and the skills piece, or we can improve the hardware, or we can upgrade your phone. So I could take the camera out and I could put a new camera in, and now I can get higher resolution photos, or I can do different types of blurring or zooming in effects that I couldn't do with my old phone. Or again, you get a software update and now you can do new cool things, or you can have new apps on your phone. It's still using the same hardware, but it doesn't have to be a physical change that occurs for you to be able to do those new cool things. And if this is confusing to you, think about what would happen if you took your first cell phone and you put the operating system you currently have on it, right? There's a lot of things in that software that theoretically you could do, or you can do on this phone, but if you put that software on an old phone, now you can't do it because it doesn't have the hardware. In the same way, if you took a brand new phone, but you put software on it from the 90s, you won't be able to do very many things on it, because even though it has all the hardware in the world, it's not able to actually execute it because there's an incompatibility between the software and hardware. So what generally happens in humans is we actually go back and forth. We have a certain amount of hardware, right? So I have physical structures in my body. When I first start learning a new task or I'm trying to learn a new sport or activity, early on, the thing that changes isn't my body, it's what's going on up here in your nervous system, right? It's the software piece. We improve the software, you get better at using our body. And so as we improve the software, when we get to a point where we don't have anything physiologically that we're not using, we max out our physiology, the software updates stop, and we have to buy a new phone, or we have to improve our musculature, and whatever we have to change or improve. And so after that standpoint, after we've maxed out the software, we add more hardware, we get more muscle mass, we then start to improve. And then we have extra muscle that we're not yet good at using. And so we add some hardware, we get that improvement, we look differently, and then we go back to a phase where we actually learn how to use that new hardware, learn how to use those upgrades. And realistically, that's what training is. It's periods where we're trying to cause physiological changes to improve what your body structures are, as well as then improving the software and how good we are at using it. Now, if we're talking about specifics, we could talk about the individual systems within your body. So for example, your cardiovascular or muscular or skeletal systems, and we could get really technical on how those things change and improve in response to training. Or, on the other hand, we could look at it from an ability standpoint. So what types of things do those changes allow? And usually when we're designing training programs, we focus more on what we want to be able to do, or what are the tasks we're trying to accomplish, rather than what are the specific things we're trying to change. And I'll kind of explain this as we go through. So for this, we're going to start by talking about what we call the strength-endurance continuum. And on one side of this continuum, we have our strength. And strength can be characterized by maximum effort, high intensity work. So if your car was broken down, could you actually push it? Could you actually move it? If a boulder fell on your leg, could you actually get it out of the way, right? Maximum effort, high intensity. Endurance, on the other hand, is your ability to do things repeatedly and not get tired or not become fatigued. And so these tasks are totally different. It's not about picking up that boulder one time to get out of a bad situation. It's about walking 5 miles a day for a month to travel where you need to go to find a better environment, or to hunt different types of animals so that you can eat, so that you can survive, right? It's long-term, repeated bouts of effort. And so we need to begin by getting specific on what we mean when we say strength and what we mean when we say endurance. Now, the definition for strength is the maximum amount of force a muscle or muscle group can generate. So if I wanted to test my biceps here and I grabbed a dumbbell and I wanted to see how much force I could produce to move that dumbbell, right? That would be a measurement of strength. And typically when we're talking about strength, we're talking about using that force and applying it to an external thing. So you have force internally, which is causing that movement, but when we look at strength, we want to see how you can impact the environment around you. So like I said before, am I moving that dumbbell? Am I pushing that car? Am I moving that rock out of the way, right? All of those things are something in our environment that we want to move, that we want to have an impact on. If you want to get technical, the formula for force is force equals mass times acceleration. So let's talk about this in terms of cars, because I think this is a really good way of beginning to think about it. If I'm driving my Toyota Camry and I'm going 60 miles an hour, right, and then I slam on the brakes, it takes me more time to actually slow down, right, because my car has so much force moving forward that my brakes have to work very hard to stop me. If instead I was going 10 miles an hour, it wouldn't take as much work. Right? It wouldn't take as much force because I'm not moving as fast, the acceleration is different. Or if we did the same experiment, so I'm going 60 miles an hour in my Toyota Camry, and then the car next to me is a semi-truck, and they're going 60 miles an hour, if we both slammed on our brakes, right? It's going to be harder for the semi-truck to slow down because it has so much mass, right? So when we're talking about moving objects, when we're talking about generating force, the two things that matter most when we're talking about it is how much mass does the object have and what's the acceleration? Am I trying to slow it down? Am I trying to speed it up? What's the change going to happen there? Another way of thinking about it is like a bullet. And a bullet has a very small amount of mass. However, when it hits an object, it actually causes a lot of damage and has a lot of force upon impact because it's moving so quickly. So the faster it's moving, the more force it's going to generate, the more damage it's going to occur when it makes an impact. So if we're talking about force and we're talking about strength, usually we're talking about what we call a 1 rep max. So what is the most amount of weight, or what's the largest mass of an object you can actually lift or move? And if you've ever seen like a powerlifting competition where the guy's doing a bench press, when he's lifting the most amount of weight, it moves very slowly. And the reason it's moving slowly is because when it has a large amount of mass, it can't have a lot of acceleration for a given amount of force. If I took that same power lifter and I gave them like a broomstick or a dowel rod, that would move really quickly because the mass is a lot smaller. And so that's what we're talking about when we say strength. We're talking about producing force. If we look at endurance, on the other hand, what we're talking about here is the capacity to engage in repeated muscular contractions. So strength was one muscular contraction as much as possible. Endurance would see how many you could do. And by definition, because it's endurance-based, it has to be a sub-maximal effort. So maximal effort is how much you could do one time. Endurance then would be less than that amount and see how many times you could do it. So if my max was 100 pounds, I could lift 100 pounds right here. If I then grabbed 80 pounds, how many times could I lift that? Right? That would show me what my endurance is. Another way of thinking about endurance is the ability to maintain a muscular contraction and what we call an isometric contraction. So if you've ever done a plank before and you get in your position and you make your body stiff, right? You're not moving, you're not going through different motion, but you're maintaining a contraction over an extended span of time. And that's another type of endurance, is maintaining a contraction or engaging in repeated contractions over the span of time. As I said before, another way of thinking about endurance is your ability to bear fatigue or bear exhaustion. So when you start doing the things that normally cause a person to grow tired and cause them to stop engaging in an activity, if you have a lot of endurance, you're able to push past it. And this is where some mental components can come into play, things like mental toughness, your ability to push past things like pain or things like discomfort. But it also can be structural. So your muscle can be set up to engage in these repeated bouts of effort and not get tired. And we'll be talking about that throughout more of these videos and throughout different courses. To test endurance, usually we take a percentage of your 1 rep max. So again, in my example, I could lift 100 pounds. Now if I take 50% of that, that's 50 pounds, how many times can I lift it? And again, when we're testing endurance, we're looking at how many times you could do it until the muscle shuts down or until you're no longer able to maintain technique. And that's something that's really important when we talk about those knowledge, skills, and abilities, is a lot of people can have good technique or have a high level of skill when they're well rested, when they don't have anything going on. It takes an entirely different level of ability to be able to maintain good form and maintain good technique when you start getting tired, when you start getting fatigued. And that's one aspect of endurance that we can actually train and help our athletes improve. So that's our strength endurance continuum. And again, it's really looking at intensity of effort versus duration of effort is really kind of the simplest way of explaining strength and endurance in different terms. But we could also look at it from a speed standpoint. This is where I like to move away from that strength endurance continuum, and instead I like to look at speed, strength, and endurance. And by adding that speed component, we're actually able to describe way more activities that matter to people. because it's not just your ability to lift something really heavy one time, and it's not your ability to lift something lighter repeated times, but speed and how quick you can move also has a big impact on a lot of different tasks, especially in sport. And so what speed is all about is it's how quickly you can do something with very little resistance. So again, if we're looking at force equals mass times acceleration, right? We're talking about acceleration being part of that speed component, how quickly something is changing in its speed. Speed is very little mass, only moving that, trying to move very quickly. And in between strength and speed, if we look at that line, what that is what we call power. And power is a combination of strength and speed. If speed is how quickly I can sprint, if you measure my mile time, power might be something like a Prowler sled where I'm trying to push that as fast as possible. So there's some type of resistance associated with power, whereas speed is usually things like body weight or no overall resistance. And so power is that line in between speed and strength. Again, if you want a formal definition, power can be defined as the rate at which work is performed. So rate is just talking about how long it takes, and then work equals force times displacement. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that, because we've already talked about force, which is mass times acceleration, but now we're adding another variable called displacement. And displacement has to do with how far an object or how far you move. So if I had a dumbbell and I wanted to lift it from here all the way up here, that would take less work than if I was picking it up off the floor, right? It would take more energy and more force to move it a greater distance. If we're looking at things like vertical jump, if I want to jump up really high, I have to generate more force than I would if I was trying to only jump a few inches off the ground. Right? So when we're talking about power, we're talking about how quickly you can perform work. If you want to write power as a formula, then it would be force times displacement, or how far the object moved, divided by how long it took. And with certain activities or certain tasks that are very explosive, you don't have a lot of time to generate a lot of force. And so the individual that's able to put a lot of force very quickly can actually perform better than someone who is stronger than them, because if it takes you a long time to use that strength, it's not going to always help you in certain activities. Now, those are the main types of things we can improve, and obviously we're improving our knowledge, skills, our abilities. That kind of explains how these things get better. But in terms of improving someone's fitness level, we can say they get stronger, they get faster, or they become more fatigue resistant or have greater endurance. Now, the last piece of this video is we're going to talk about how we should do that. And this is really challenging to kind of piece out, because there are so many different ways of engaging in exercise and engaging in training to make you better. And what I like to do is I like to kind of explain the idea that I personally believe there's such a thing as good training and there's such a thing as bad training. And while yes, different types of training might work for different people, different types of training might make sense in certain contexts but not others, if we use these principles as a way of kind of defining if training is good or not, I think it's a good way to kind of start laying out how you should train yourself and also how you should train the people you're working with. Now, the first characteristic that I think makes training good and not bad is it has to improve someone's health or fitness. If I put you on a training plan and you don't actually get any results, you're not getting healthier, you're not losing weight, you're not getting stronger or faster, my training program isn't very good. And so when we're designing a training plan, and again, people are going to come to you with different goals, if you can't help them reach their goal, if you can't actually help them make progress towards their goal, you really shouldn't be their coach, you really shouldn't be designing training plans. And so the first thing we have to do is we have to understand how to actually create a plan that gets people effective results. Now, while getting someone results is obviously going to be a big factor in whether or not the training plan is good, that's not the only factor we need to consider. And it's possible that you design a plan that starts off really good and starts off really well, but a few months in has some problems and maybe causes an injury or causes some type of issue to happen physiologically. And so it's not enough just to get someone results. We also need to be cognizant that the training we're putting people in can actually lead to injury or actually lead to some types of problems. And so what I say in terms of a good training plan is it also has to minimize injury risk. And there's something there that's really, really specific and technical, is it doesn't eliminate injuries. And it's possible you design a training plan that causes an injury to someone and it's not necessarily a bad training plan, right? Someone could get injured following the latest training science, following an expert in the field. If you look at pro athletes, none of their coaches are idiots in terms of what they're doing for training. They're just getting injured because they're competing at such a high level and they're doing things that are considered high risk. And so when I create a plan, what I need to do is I need to evaluate what are the exercises we're going to be doing, what are the types of tasks we're going to be doing, and is the benefits we gain from doing those tasks worth the potential risk? So right now, you're probably seated, maybe you're in your car, maybe you're sitting in class, maybe you're sitting at home on the couch or something, and right now your risk of injury physically is very low, right? It would be very hard to sprain your ankle while sitting on the couch. If you got up off the couch and you just went for a walk across the neighborhood, your risk of injury just went up, right? You could get hit by a car, you could sprain your ankle, you could have damage to one of your muscles or a tendon or something if you stepped weird, right? All these things theoretically could happen to cause an injury. That said, I would be willing to bet from a health or fitness standpoint that getting off the couch and actually walking or moving is worth the small risk of causing an injury. That said, it would probably be a really bad idea to take someone who's never exercised before in their life, put a bunch of weight on their back and have them doing something like weighted box jumps, which have a higher risk of injury when they haven't been trained, when they don't have the techniques to avoid that injury. And so as coaches, we need to be mindful of picking things that minimize the risk as much as possible in line with getting them the results they want to achieve. Another type of injury that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about training are overuse injuries. And what overuse injuries are there's something you're doing in training which if you do it a few times isn't a big deal, but if you do it a lot of times in a row and you're not giving yourself enough breaks, you're not giving yourself enough time to recover, they can actually build off of another and cause a big problem long term. So when we're designing training plans, we need to keep in mind that overuse injuries can happen if we don't take breaks or if we don't train a variety of different things and if we only do the same thing again, and again for weeks, for months, for years, right? And we definitely don't want an overuse injury because by definition, injuries are maladaptive. They're limiting your ability to do different tasks. The third characteristic I use to define if training is good or bad is whether or not it's efficient. And you might have a training plan that, let's say the person's goal was to lose weight, and you're working with them and they lose weight, they lose 10 pounds in 6 months, and they work out 3 times a week. And at the same time, we're able to clone that person. I train someone and it's the same person and they lose 10 pounds, but they do it in 3 months and they only have to work out twice per week. I would be a better coach. My plan would be a better training plan compared to yours. Again, assuming they were exactly the same in terms of people, right? Which is theoretically possible, but practically impossible, right? But if it was the exact same person and my training plan got them the results in less time with less work put in, my training plan is better. And so when we create training plans, a big thing we need to keep in mind is efficiency. And how efficient is our plan? Is it worth it to do different tasks, or are those the long way of doing them? Or is it something that maybe will help them a little bit but won't actually help them a lot? So when we're designing a training plan, we need to start with the things we know are efficient that are going to give them the most bang for their buck in terms of their effort or in terms of their time. And then after they master those, or after they incorporate those, start sprinkling in the little details. And a lot of people have heard this story before with the jar, and they basically have, it's usually golf balls or really big stones, then you have pebbles, then you have sand. And if you start by filling the jar with sand, and then you put your pebbles and then the big rocks, it doesn't actually fit. What you need to start with is you need to start with the big objects first, and then put the smaller objects, because they'll fit in the cracks, they'll slide in all together. And that's really what efficiency is. Efficiency is just figuring out what are those things that are going to have the biggest impact, and making sure you're doing those before you start focusing on the little details. The last variable then is whether or not it's based on training principles, or another way of saying it is whether or not it's based on science. And what we know is that we've been studying how humans train and how humans perform for hundreds of years now at this point. And it would be really silly for someone to create a training plan and not be aware of what are some of those training principles or how they should actually design their plan. And so a lot of programs that don't get people results, that lead to injuries, or that are not efficient, violate one or more of the training principles or the main concepts associated with training, or they go against what science has told us. So if the first three are kind of the fruits of the labor, if we look at a plan and what it does in terms of when they're working with it, if they're not getting better at it, if they're getting injured, or if it's taking them a lot longer than it should, training principles are really how we go about doing that and how we evaluate if we're going to have those results. Now, that's a good overview or starting point for understanding what training is. And again, just to kind of reiterate our main points, training is a process for developing knowledge, skills, or abilities to accomplish a goal or a task. And the big goals people have for this are they want to have an increase in their health, they want to feel better, they want to perform better, they want to be able to do the things in their life that matter to them, or they want to have improved aesthetics, they want to feel better about themselves, they want to be more attractive to others, right? And then if we talk about what types of abilities are improving, we talk about that strength, we talk about that speed, we talk about that endurance, and how those things allow you to accomplish daily tasks. And then lastly, we explained how you do it. We explained that through science, we can create plans that get people results, that minimize their risk of injury, and that do it as efficiently as possible. And overall, that's what you need to understand before we can start layering in some of the details for how we train people. Thank you for watching this video. If you have questions, please reach out. Otherwise, hopefully I'll see you in another video.